The 61st plenary meeting of the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly is called to order. The Assembly will continue its consideration of the Agenda Item 5, entitled Illegal Israeli Actions in Occupied East Jerusalem and the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory, to hear the remaining speakers in explanation of vote. After the vote, to be followed by the continuation of the debate on the item. Before giving the floor for explanation of vote, after the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seat. Now I will give the floor to the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Mr. President, the Islamic Republic of Iran expresses its profound concern over the continued violations by the Israeli authorities of fundamental principles of international law, human rights law, and humanitarian law. This regime must adhere to ceasefire agreements and fully comply with all relevant United Nations resolutions, including the resolution adopted on 12 of June 2025. Israeli occupying forces have repeatedly engaged in acts of aggression against the occupied territories. In addition to the devastating and genocidal attacks against Palestinians, Israeli apartheid regime has systematically weaponized starvation as a means of ethnic cleansing and mass atrocities. All these would not have been possible without United States' green light and relentless support. Furthermore, thousands of Palestinians, including children, have endured prolonged military and arbitrary detention, often facing ill treatment, forced confessions, and separation from their families while being denied legal representation and subjected to harsh conditions. Mr. President, the Islamic Republic of Iran voted in favor of the resolution, given the urgency of the humanitarian situation and the importance of an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, and also the necessity of expediting all necessary measures to ensure compliance by Israel with its obligations in line with international law and the United Nations Charter, including to respect and protect all civilians as well as United Nations and humanitarian staff. Accordingly, my delegation recalls the international demand for immediate release of all Palestinian prisoners and return them as well as other Palestinian civilians to their homes, as underscored in Operative Paragraph 3 of the resolution. In this context, my delegation dissociates itself from Operative Paragraph 2 on the grounds that it lacks balance and fails to acknowledge the widespread and systematic practice of arbitrary detention affecting thousands of Palestinians who continue to be held in Israel prisons under conditions that have been widely documented for violence, inhuman treatment, and grave human rights violations. In addition, my delegation reiterates that its support for the resolution does not affect Iran's long-standing and consistent national position on the question of Palestine, which includes non-recognition of the Israeli regime. Last but not least, I should want to recall on 13 June 2025, the Israeli regime initiated an unprovoked and premeditated aggression against the Islamic Republic of Iran, targeting civilian populated areas where millions of people live, killing more than 200 of civilians, including women, children, scientists, and university professors, while leaving more than 1,000 injured. The criminal regime of Israel has also committed acts of terrorism by targeting Iranian peaceful nuclear facilities, which are under full supervision of the IAEA. Such abhorrent crimes do not surprise anyone, as the genocidal regime has demonstrated since its illegitimate inception to the present day its total criminal nature and hatred towards international law and the Charter of the United Nations. Iran is now defending itself against a cruel aggression. The United Nations system, especially the United Nations Security Council and its member states, must not defeat the very purpose of the United Nations. The Security Council members shall and must act now in furtherance of the Council's primary responsibility and stop the aggressor from committing more atrocities. The path to regional stability requires an immediate end to Israel's aggression and accountability for its violations of international law. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Hungary.
Mr. President, we are here today to discuss the dire humanitarian situation and the demand for an end to the conflict in Gaza. On the resolution adopted during last week's ESS, Hungary voted no, because we cannot support any document that fails to condemn Hamas and its heinous terrorist attacks and calls for an unconditional ceasefire without the release of hostages. We must not forget that the conflict that the General Assembly seeks to end by imposing an unconditional ceasefire was ignited by the horrendous and brutal acts of terrorism committed by Hamas on October 7, 2023. Any country would have the right and responsibility to ensure that such an attack could never happen again. Hostages are still being held, and innumerable survivors are traumatized. The picture today is catastrophic, and we express our solidarity with Israeli and Palestinian innocent civilians caught in the conflict. There are no excuses left for Hamas to continue rejecting a ceasefire and put innocent Palestinian civilians at risk every day. Let us be absolutely clear. The deliberate targeting, kidnapping, and prolonged detention of civilians is a grave violation of international humanitarian law. It is an affront to humanity and demands not only moral outrage, but decisive international action. Hungary condemns, in the strongest possible terms, the use of hostages as instruments of terror and political leverage. We stand firmly with the families whose lives have been shattered by this ordeal and with all those still waiting for their loved ones to return home. We call for the immediate, dignified and unconditional release of all remaining hostages, including a Hungarian dual citizen. Hungary reaffirms its commitment to the security of the State of Israel and the protection of all civilians across the region. Peace will only come when terror is no longer tolerated by anyone, anywhere. It is high time for this conflict to end, for the hostages to be released, and for Palestinian civilians to begin rebuilding their lives. However, the fighting must end in a sustainable way. A ceasefire between Israel and Hamas is the only way to bring about a durable end to this conflict. But Hamas has failed to accept any agreement so far that would bring hostages home, ensure Israel's security, enable a surge in humanitarian relief to Palestinians, and set the stage for a political settlement which can provide a better future for Israelis and Palestinians alike. All civilian life matters equally. We note with utmost concern the unacceptable number of civilian casualties, especially children, as well as the catastrophic levels of hunger and imminent risk of famine caused by the insufficient entry of aid into Gaza. It is time for this conflict to end. However, the only durable way to resolve this conflict is to establish a ceasefire that also guarantees the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held in Gaza. These two urgent goals are inextricably linked. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Hungary and give the floor to the distinguished representative of Argentina.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much,
La República
President.
Argentina reafirma su
Argentina
compromiso con el
reaffirms
derecho
its
internacional
commitment to
humanitario,
international
la
humanitarian
protección
law,
de
the
civiles y la
protection of
búsqueda de una
civilians,
solución
and the
pacífica,
search for
negociada
a
y
peaceful,
duradera en el
negotiated,
conflicto de
and
Medio
lasting
Oriente.
solution to the conflict
Sin
in the
embargo,
Middle East.
la Argentina se ha
But
visto en la necesidad de
Argentina
votar en contra del
had to
proyecto de
vote
resolución
against
por
the
las
draft
siguientes
resolution
razones.
as a result of the
Primero,
following reasons.
la omisión de
One,
una
the
condena clara y
omission of a
explícita a
clear,
los
explicit
atentados terroristas
condemnation
del
of
7
the
de octubre
terrorist
de
attacks of the 7th
2023,
of October
que resultaron en la muerte de
which
muertos de
led
civiles y
to the
desencadenaron la
deaths
actual
of hundreds
escalada
of
de
civilians
violencia.
and triggered
La ausencia de
escalation of
dicha
violence.
condena
The absence of
socava
this
la
condemnation
legitimidad del
undermines the
texto.
legitimacy of the
Segundo,
text.
el
2.
evidente
The
desequilibrio
clear
en la asignación de
imbalance in the
responsabilidades
assignation of
que ignora los
responsibility,
crímenes
which
y
ignores the
violaciones del derecho
crimes and
internacional
violations of
cometidos por
international
grupos
law
terroristas como
committed by
Hamas,
terrorist groups
incluyendo
such
el
as
secuestro de
Hamas,
rehenes,
including
el uso de
the
escudos
kidnapping
humanos y
of
los ataques deliberados
hostages
contra
and the
civiles.
use of human
Tercero,
shields. 3.
la falta de toda
The lack
referencia
of any
al derecho de
reference
los estados a
to
proteger a
the
su
rights
población
of
frente a
states to
ataques
protect their
armados
people from
conforme al
armed
derecho
attacks in line
internacional.
with international
Una
law.
resolución
A
equilibrada debe
balanced
reconocer el
resolution
derecho a la
must
legítima
recognize the right
defensa
to
siempre
self-defense
dentro del marco jurídico.
within
4.
the legal
La
framework.
Argentina
4.
reitera que
Argentina
apoya
reiterates that
firmemente
it
la entrega
strongly
urgente de asistencia
supports
humanitaria y
the
el acceso
delivery
sin
of humanitarian
restricciones
aid
de la ayuda a los civiles en Gaza.
for civilians in Gaza.
En consonancia con sus
In line with
principios,
its
la Argentina
principles, Argentina
reafirma su compromiso con la
reaffirms its
protección de
commitments to
civiles,
the
el
protection
rechazo
of
al
civilians,
terrorismo
the
y la
rejection of
protección de la paz
terrorism,
mediante
and the
soluciones
promotion of peace
equilibradas y
through
responsables.
balanced,
Muchas
responsible
gracias.
solutions. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Argentina, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Angola.
Mr. President, the resumption of this emergency special session comes at a very challenging and complex international context and represents yet another test to multilateralism as a mechanism to resolving the intricate international challenges we face today. The international community must act now to alleviate human suffering of the Palestinian people and mitigate the risks, the risk of the Gaza crisis spillover and turning into a regional conflict with dangerous implications for international peace and security. The only viable way to achieve durable peace in the Middle East is through dialogue and peaceful settlement of disputes. For this reason, the Republic of Angola voted in favor of the draft resolution submitted by Spain. Mr. President, the Republic of Angola regrets the fact that due to a vote of a permanent member, the Security Council on 4th June 2025 did not adopt an important resolution demanding an immediate, permanent, and unconditional ceasefire and immediate, independent humanitarian access, which could have helped to alleviate the immense suffering of the civilians in the Gaza Strip. The Security Council must uphold its primary responsibilities for maintenance of international peace and security, as stated in the UN Charter, particularly in the face of the grave crisis and humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Gaza. Today's global challenges reinforce the Republic of Angola's conviction about the urgent need to reform the United Nations system, especially its Security Council, to make it effective, representative, and inclusive, and able to strengthen multilateralism as the way of dealing with common and interconnected threats and preserving world peace and security. Mr. President, we support the ongoing diplomatic efforts to bring back the parties to fully and conditionally and without delay implement all the provisions of the Security Council Resolution 2735 of 10 June 2024 to end the war in Gaza. The current challenges of peace and security in the Middle East demonstrate the urgency of prioritizing the search for a fair and sustainable solution based on the application of relevant United Nations resolutions and international law, with the aim of achieving the two states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security within internationally recognized borders. In this context, this delegation looks forward to upcoming high-level international conference for the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine and the implementation of two-state solution to be held under the chairmanship of Saudi Arabia and France. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Angola. We have heard the last speaker in the explanations of vote after the vote. As agreed at the 60th plenary meeting on 12 June 2025, the Assembly will resume the debate on agenda item 5. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uganda. Uganda, on behalf of the non-aligned movement. Please, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, I'm honored to deliver this statement on behalf of the 121 member states of the non-aligned movement, NAM, at this resumed 10th emergency session of the General Assembly. NAM reaffirms its long-standing, common, and principled position on the question of Palestine and is deeply concerned about the implications of the conflict in Gaza to the region and the continuation of this illegal occupation. There has been no reprieve to the grave situation in Gaza, and the conflict has dramatically intensified, worsening the catastrophic humanitarian situation not only in Gaza but also in the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. The members of the United Nations conferred on the UN Security Council the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security in accordance with Articles 12 and 24 of the Charter. The Security Council must uphold its mandate to maintain international peace and security and must act in consonance without making the question of Palestine an exception to international law and to the authority of the Security Council. Therefore, NAM calls on the Security Council to justly resolve the Palestinian question, to bring an end to this protracted conflict and tragic injustice. The just and peaceful solution to the question of Palestine is central to establishing durable peace and stability in the Middle East and is a matter of grave concern for the maintenance of international peace and security. NAM deeply regrets the veto cast by the United States in the Security Council on 4th June that once again prevented the Council from upholding its responsibilities in the face of this grave crisis. NAM recognizes the important role played by the elected 10 members of the Council, among them 6 NAM countries, in responsibly pursuing this important initiative and regrets its obstruction despite the unanimity of 14 Council members representing the broader international community. The non-aligned movement demands an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza and expresses support for all the ongoing diplomatic efforts, especially by Egypt and Qatar, to reach an agreement for an immediate, comprehensive, and permanent ceasefire. NAM condemns negative efforts by Israel that undermine peace and security in the Middle East, and accordingly calls for the cessation of military campaign in Gaza, release of all hostages, exchange of Palestinian prisoners, return of Palestinian civilians to their homes and neighborhoods in all areas of Gaza, and the safe and effective distribution of sufficient humanitarian assistance throughout the Gaza Strip to all Palestinian civilians who need it, including medical needs. Now members also express concern at reports of forced starvation and forced displacement of the civilian population throughout Gaza. Mr. President, the non-aligned member states once again reiterate their call for the continued provision of the needed humanitarian and socio-economic assistance to the Palestinian people, including the Palestine refugees. The movement reaffirms the continued indispensability of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, along with other United Nations agencies and international organizations in alleviating their plight, and urges the international community to support the agency with sufficient and predictable funding without blocking this humanitarian work. NAM rejects an attempt by Israel to sideline UNRWA as this poses a threat to its humanitarian role in accordance with its General Assembly mandate. The movement calls for the permanent end to hostilities and for the start of a major multi-year reconstruction plan for Gaza, with international support swiftly mobilized based on the Arab and OIC Gaza Relief and Early Recovery Plan in full coordination with the State of Palestine. We underline that this should result also in the release of thousands of other Palestinians that for years have been held captive in Israeli prisons and detention centers, among them children, and women. Moreover, now member states reiterate the long-standing call for the complete cessation of all Israeli settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and violations of the historic status quo of Jerusalem and its holy sites, as well as the halt of all attempts to forcibly displace Palestinian refugees and civilians, to seize and annex Palestinian territory, including the Gaza Strip. Needless to say, it is of utmost importance to swiftly advance in all these fields, including with the taking of urgent accountability measures in line with international law, the relevant UN resolutions, and the International Court of Justice 19th July 2024 advisory opinion, and the provisional measures ordered by the court as indicated in January, March, and May 2024 in the case of South Africa versus Israel under the Genocide Convention. All of this is vital to alleviate the catastrophic humanitarian situation, to protect the Palestinian civilian population, and in order to thwart the attempts to destroy the two-state solution. NAM welcomes the ongoing actions in support of the implementation of the relevant UN resolutions on the two-state solution and the comprehensive, just, and peaceful settlement of the Palestinian question. To this end, we welcome the convening of the high-level international conference on the implementation of the resolutions pertaining to the question of Palestine and the two-state solution in line with UNGA Resolution ES10/24 and all relevant resolutions under the co-chairmanship of Saudi Arabia and France, and welcome the strong and principled positions affirmed in the recent consultations convened on 9th April and the preparatory meetings of senior officials held on 23rd May 2025. Similarly, NAM commends the efforts undertaken within the framework of the Global Alliance for the implementation of the two-state solution under the chairmanship of Saudi Arabia, EU, and Norway, and urges concrete follow-up of these important initiatives. To conclude, Mr. President, the movement seizes this opportunity to reiterate its call for collective international efforts to uphold international law and to bring an end to this historic and grave injustice. Now, member states reaffirm their commitment to promoting a just, lasting, comprehensive, and peaceful solution to the question of Palestine in all its aspects, including for the plight of the Palestinian refugees, and reaffirm their support for the Palestinian people in their struggle to achieve justice and fulfill their inalienable rights and legitimate national aspirations, including to self-determination, freedom, and independence in their sovereign and independent state of Palestine, with East Jerusalem as its capital. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Uganda, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of European Union on behalf of the EU and its member states.
I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union, the candidate countries Montenegro and Bosnia-Herzegovina, as well as Armenia, Andorra, and San Marino aligned themselves with this statement. We thank you, President, for convening this debate following the vote in the Security Council on 4th of June. We also thank the E10 for the efforts in tabling this resolution, which has received the support of 14 Council members. The humanitarian situation, notably caused by the blocking of humanitarian aid entering Gaza for over 2 months, has reached an unprecedented level of catastrophe that requires our urgent and sustained attention. The suffering of the civilian population must end. Delivering humanitarian assistance at scale, the release of all hostages, and the return to a ceasefire leading to a permanent end to hostilities are all essential. The EU once again unequivocally condemns Hamas' brutal and indiscriminate terrorist attacks of October 7th. The EU also deplores the unacceptable number of civilian casualties, especially children, in Gaza and the West Bank, as well as the risk of famine caused by the insufficient entry of aid into Gaza following Israel's response to these attacks. We also recall the need to fully implement the International Court of Justice orders. The EU urged all parties to comply with their obligations under international law, including international human rights law and international humanitarian law. Our message is clear. Humanitarian aid must never be politicized or militarized. Aid must reach civilians in need. We recall the importance of unimpeded access and sustained distribution of humanitarian assistance at scale into and throughout Gaza. The EU also urged Israel to act on the basis of the UN proposals under the 2720 mechanism and to ensure full respect of international humanitarian law and of the core principles of humanitarian action, humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence by constructively discussing with the UN and designated NGOs. The EU takes note of the UN General Assembly resolution proposed and adopted last week, which recalls the return to an immediate and conditional permanent ceasefire, the release of hostages, and the commitment to a lasting and sustainable peace based on the two-state solution. It is time to break the cycle of violence and ensure peace and security for all. The EU will continue to work with regional and international partners to that end. Allow me to reiterate the essential role of the UN agencies, including UNRWA, which provides crucial services to millions of people in Gaza, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and across the region, including Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. The EU also strongly condemns the further escalation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, following increased settler violence, the expansion of illegal settlements, Israeli military operations, and increased terrorist attacks against Israel. We reiterate our commitment to international law and to a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace based on the two-state solution in accordance with relevant UN Security Council resolutions where two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, live side by side in peace and mutual recognition within secure and recognized borders. The EU will continue to spare no effort to help revive the political process, including through the Global Alliance for the Two-State Solution, and is looking forward to the high-level international conference for the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine and the implementation of the two-state solution hosted by France and Saudi Arabia. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Slovenia on behalf of the E10 group.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the E10 members of the Security Council. Algeria, Denmark, Greece, Guyana, Panama, Pakistan, Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone, Somalia, and my own country, Slovenia. We believe the war in Gaza must come to an immediate halt. All hostages must be immediately and unconditionally released, and civilians in Gaza must not starve and must have full and unimpeded access to aid. The elected members had prepared a concise draft humanitarian resolution expressing grave concern over the situation in Gaza, including the risk of famine that regrettably was not adopted. The resolution reaffirmed that all parties must comply with their obligations under international law. It further expressed support to the efforts of mediators to immediately bring parties back to implementing the ceasefire agreement in line with the Resolution 2735 of the Council. Importantly, the resolution demanded an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza respected by all parties. It also recalled the demand of the Council for the immediate, dignified, and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas or other groups. The draft also contained an unequivocal demand for the immediate and unconditional lifting of all restrictions on the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza, its safe and unhindered distribution at scale, including by the UN and humanitarian partners throughout the Gaza Strip, as well as the restoration of all essential services in line with international humanitarian law, the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, and the relevant resolutions of the Security Council. Mr. President, the resolution was prompted by our deep concern over the catastrophic situation in Gaza, which deteriorated further after the resumption of hostilities in March. We have heard numerous briefings and followed closely the deeply disturbing reports coming from the ground, including in relation to the functioning of the newly established aid distribution centers. We continue to fully support the ongoing diplomatic efforts by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar aimed at achieving a return to the ceasefire and hostage release deal. We firmly believe that the Security Council must also act urgently and decisively to address the humanitarian situation in Gaza in accordance with its mandate for the maintenance of international peace and security. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Slovenia, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
شكر سيد الرئيس
Thank you,
سادة
Mr.
الأعضاء
President.
بداية
Ladies and
نتوجه
gentlemen,
بالشكر
we
لكل
would
من
like
صوت
to
لصالح
express
مشروع
our
القرار
appreciation to all of those who voted in
بجانب
favor of the
الحق
resolution,
والعدل.
who stood
نشكر
on the
كل من
side of
تبنى
right and justice.
بوصلة
We thank
أخلاقية
all of those who
وإنسانية
have
سليمة
had a sound
وصوت لصالح
moral and
إنقاذ
humanitarian compass
المدنيين
and
والأبرياء
voted
في
in favor
غزة.
of saving civilians
سيد
and
الرئيس،
innocents in Gaza.
نجتمع بالجلسة
Mr.
الطارئة
President, we
المستأنفة
meet
بعد
here
عرقلة
at
إصدار
the
قرار من
resumed
مجلس
emergency
الأمن
special session
جراء
after the
الفيتو
Security
الأمريكي.
Council was unable to
مشروع قرار
pass a
عكس
resolution
الإرادة
because of
الدولية
the
الواسعة
American
لإيقاف
veto. It
تلك
was a
الحرب
draft
الجائرة على
resolution that
غزة.
reflected a widespread
وسانده
international
باقي
desire
الأعضاء
to
في
put an end
مجلس
to the war in
الأمن
Gaza, which was
جميعا
supported by the rest of the members of the
14
Security
عضو.
Council, 14
مشروع
members.
قرار
There was a draft
هادفة
resolution
لوقف
that
الجرائم
aimed to put an
الإسرائيلية
end
البشعة
to the
المستمرة في
ugly
غزة
and continued Israeli
وإنقاذ
crimes
الأبرياء
in Gaza.
والأطفال
It
والمدنيين
aimed to save
وإنهاء
innocents,
الحصار
children and
الجائر
civilians, and to put an
المفروض
end
عليه.
to the oppressive siege
وإذا هذا
imposed on
الموقف
them.
الأحادي لجأنا
And
للجمعية
faced with
العامة
this unilateral
التي
position,
يجلس فيها
we
كافة أعضاء المجتمع
headed
الدولي
to
على
the General
قدم
Assembly,
المساواة
where all members of the
دون
international
امتياز
community are
حق
equals.
نقد
Without
بأغلبية ساحقة
without
الثاني عشر
the
من
privilege
يونيو
of
مشروع
the veto,
قرار
and we
يرسي
adopted
الحد الأدنى من
an
العدالة
overwhelming majority a
ويحقق
draft
النظر
resolution that
اليسير
sets
من
the
اعتبارات
minimum level
إنسانية
of justice and
بهدف إنقاذ
which
الشعب
demands
الفلسطيني من
the
جرائم
most
الحرب
basic of humanitarian
المتواصلة
considerations
التي
with the
تبث
aim of
جميعا
saving the
أمامنا
Palestinian
على
people
الهواء
from the continued war
مباشرة
crimes that we are
لأكثر من عام
witnessing
ونصف.
live on the air and have
تلك
been witnessing
الجرائم
for over a
التي
year and a half.
فشلنا
These
مرارا
crimes we have repeatedly
بوقفها
failed in putting
دون
an
تبرير
end to
يذكر
with no
وبشكل ستسجله
mentionable
كتب التاريخ
justification and in a
بكل
manner
أسف
that will be
كفصل
unfortunately
مخزن
recorded in
من
history
العسير على
as
الأجيال
a dark
القادمة
and embarrassing
استيعابها
chapter that future
وتقبلها.
generations will have a
سيد
hard
الرئيس
time
في
understanding
ذلك
and
السياق
accepting.
المؤلم
Mr. President,
ووسط
in light of
السيولة
this
المتزايدة في الشرق
painful
الأوسط تشدد مصر على
context
النقاط
and in
التالية.
light of the escalating
أولاً،
situation in the Middle East, we in Egypt would like to
منح
make the
ميثاق الأمم
following
المتحدة عند تأسيسها حق
The
النقد
United Nations
للأعضاء
Charter, when it was
الدائمين
formed,
بمجلس الأمن
granted the veto to the
كقوة
permanent members of the
ضامنة
Security
للالتزام
Council
بالروح
as powers that
وأهداف
are
ومقاصد
supposed to
ميثاق الأمم
guarantee
المتحدة
commitment to the spirit and
بهدف ضمان
objectives and
الأمن
purposes of
والسلم
the
الدوليين.
Charter with the purpose of securing and
قد
maintaining
أتى ذلك
international
الفيتو
peace and
الأخير
security. And this
والمتكرر
recent and repeated
ليضرب
veto
بهذه الالتزامات عرض
has
الحائط
torpedoed
ويسمح
these
لإسرائيل
commitments, has
باستمرار
allowed and
عدوانها
allows Israel
الغاشم
to
على
continue
المدنيين
its
العزل
unjust
في
aggression
غزة.
against unarmed civilians
إن
in
تكرار
Gaza.
مثل هذا الموقف يؤكد
repeated
بشكل
position
قاطع صحة ما ذهبت إليه مصر
With no doubt,
والكثير من الدول
Egypt
الأعضاء
has been calling for,
بضرورة
Egypt along with many
إصلاح
other
مجلس
member states,
الأمن
calling for,
بشكل
which is the
شامل
need to comprehensively
وفي
reform the
مقدمة
Security Council,
ذلك تصحيح العوار
and at the
الخاص
forefront of which
بمسألة الفيتو
remedying
مرة واحدة
this
وللأبد.
veto defect once and for all.
ثانيا،
Second,
تشدد مصر أن هذا الفيتو
Egypt
الأخير لا
reaffirms that
يغير
this
من
recent
حقيقتين
veto does not
ساطعتين
change two
أولاهما
absolute
أن
facts.
إسرائيل
The first
ارتكب
is that
وترتكب
Israel has
جرائم
committed and
حرب
continues
وجرائم ضد
to commit
الإنسانية
war
بصورة
crimes and
ممنهجة
crimes
في
against
غزة
humanity systematically in Gaza.
يقف وراءها اليمين الإسرائيلي
And standing behind
المتشدد
it is the extremist Israeli
وكبار
right
قادة إسرائيل
and Israel's top leaders.
وهو ما يستوجب حتما
This definitely
المحاسبة
requires
وإنفاذ العدالة.
accountability and justice.
والحقيقة الثانية الساطعة هي
second
وجود إجماع دولي
absolute
واضح
fact
وقاطع
is that
على
there
ضرورة
is
وقف
a
هذه
clear and
الحرب الجائرة
absolute
فورا
international agreement on
وإنقاذ
the need to
الشعب
immediately
الفلسطيني
stop this war, to
وإيقاف
save the
الانتهاكات
Palestinian people,
الجسيمة
to put an
المرتكبة
end to the
بحق
grave
المدنيين
violations
في غزة.
perpetrated against civilians in
وهو ما
Gaza.
عكسه
This
التصويت
was
الكاسح
embodied in
المؤيد
the
للقرار الذي
overwhelming
اتخذناه
vote in
الثاني
favor
عشر
of the
من
resolution adopted on the 12th of June.
ثالثا،
Third,
يقع علينا جميعا واجب قانوني وأخلاقي
a legal
ولا
and
يمكن
moral
التحلل
duty
منه
that
برفض
we
مثل
cannot
هذا
renege.
الفيتو
A duty to
ورفض
reject
أن
such a
يكون
veto.
غطاء سياسيا أو
Reject
قانونيا
using it
لاستمرار
as a
الحرب.
political or legal cover
فحق
for the
النقد
continuation
لا
of the war.
يسمو على
The
القوانين
right of the
الدولية
veto
بل وعلى
does not
الطبيعة
transcend international
البشرية
law. It
التي
does not
ترفض
transcend human
قتل
nature,
الأطفال
which
والأبرياء
rejects the
في
killing
غزة.
of children and innocents in Gaza.
وأعضاء الأسرة الدولية
The
ملزمون
international
سويا
community
وكلا
are
على
obliged
حدة
together
باستخدام
and
كافة
individually
الوسائل
to
للضغط
use
على
all means
إسرائيل
possible to pressure Israel
وإجبارها
and
على
force
وقف
it
العدوان
to stop this
وإنهاء
aggression,
الحصار
to put an
والتجويع
end to the siege, to
وإنفاذ
put an end
المساعدات
to the
الإنسانية دون
starvation,
قيد
and
أو
to allow
شرط
access with no
وتنفيذ
conditions
القرارات
to
الأممية
humanitarian
وإجراءات
aid, to
محكمة
implement
العدل
United Nations
الدولية
resolutions
التحفظية.
and the ICJ's
رابعاً
measures. Fourth,
تناشدكم مصر أيضا
Egypt
تطوير لغة
calls on
ومصطلحات
you
القانون
to
الدولي
develop
الإنساني
the language and the
والخطاب
terminology
الإنساني
of international
عموما
humanitarian law
لتتواكب
and
مع
international
جرائم
rhetoric,
إسرائيل في
humanitarian
غزة
rhetoric in general,
حاليا.
so that they can keep pace with
فمن حق
Israel's
الشعب
crimes in
الفلسطيني أن
Gaza.
يتم
The
الاعتراف
Palestinian people have a
بمأساته
right to have
والإقرار
their
بالجرائم
tragedy
المرتكبة
acknowledged,
بحقه
to have a
منذ عقود
recognition
طويلة
of the crimes that have been
ومن
perpetrated
ثم
against them
إخراجه
for
من مهانة
decades, so
الاحتلال
that they
إلى
can
كرامة
be
الاستقلال
salvaged
وعز
from the
الحق
indignity
في تقرير
of
المصير.
occupation to the
هو
dignity of
الشعب الوحيد
independence and
الذي يحيا في
self-determination.
ظل
The
جرائم حرب
Palestinians are the
وفظائع
only
غير
people living
مسبوقة
under war
تبث
crimes
على
and
الهواء مباشرة
unprecedented
دون
atrocities
أفق
that
لإنهاء.
are aired without that we follow live on the air with no
تؤكد مصر
horizon
عزمها على
for an
الاستمرار
end.
الحثيث في جهود الوساطة مع
Egypt
الشركاء
confirms its
من قطر
intention
والولايات
to
المتحدة
continue its
الأمريكية
intensive
للتوصل
efforts at
لاتفاق
mediation with our
وقف
partners
إطلاق
Qatar
نار
and the
دائم
United States to arrive
وإنهاء
at a
الحصار
permanent
الإسرائيلي على
ceasefire
غزة.
and to put an end to the
كما
Israeli siege on
تطالبكم
Gaza.
مصر بتنفيذ
Egypt
القرارات
calls upon you
الأممية
to implement United
واعتماد
Nations
قرار
resolutions and
جديد
to
من
adopt
مجلس
a
الأمن
new Security
يلزم
Council
إسرائيل
resolution
بوقف
that
عدوانها
obliges Israel
وجرائمها.
to put an end to its
فالوساطة
aggression and
لا
its crimes.
تتعارض مع دور
Mediation does not
الأمم
run
المتحدة
counter to the
وأجهزتها
role of the
إذا
United
وقف
Nations
العدوان
and its
وإنقاذ
bodies in
الأمن.
putting an end to the aggression and
سادساً
saving innocence.
تحذر مصر
6. Egypt
أيضا من
warns
مغبة تصاعد
of
الممارسات
the danger
الاحتلالية
of
في
the
الضفة
escalating
الغربية
occupation
والقدس
practices in
الشرقية
the West Bank and
وتطالب
East
بوقف
Jerusalem.
هجمات
Egypt calls for an
الإسرائيلية على
end to
المدن
the Israeli
الفلسطينية
attacks on
ووقف
Palestinian
توسع
cities, to
المستوطنات
put an end
ومعاقبة
to the expansion of
المستوطنين على
settlements, to
إرهابهم
punishing the settlers for their
والسماح للشعب
terrorism,
الفلسطيني
to allow
الشقيق
the
بالحركة
sisterly and brotherly
دون
Palestinian
قيود
people to
والوصول
move with
لمواردهم
no
ووقف الانتهاكات
limitations
للمواقع
and to be able
المقدسة
to
في
access the
القدس أو
resources, to
المساس
put an end
بوضعها
to the
القائم
violations perpetrated
وأيضا
against
رفع
holy
كافة
sites in
القيود على
Jerusalem
العمل
and
وكالة
affect its
الأونروا في
status
الأرض
and to lift
الفلسطينية
all the limitations that are being imposed
سابعاً
on UNRWA and its work in the
تندد
occupied
مصر
Palestinian
أيضا
territories. 7.
بالهجمات الإسرائيلية ضد
Egypt condemns
الجمهورية
the
الإسلامية
Israeli
الإيرانية
attacks against the Islamic
وكذلك
Republic
أي
of Iran.
ممارسات
We
تمثل
condemn
خرقا
any
للقانون الدولي وميثاق
practices that
الأمم
are a
المتحدة
violation of
وسيادة
international law, the
الدول
United Nations Charter,
ووحدة
and the
أراضيها
sovereignty of
ومبادئ حسن
countries, the
الجوار
territorial
وتسوية
integrity, the
النزاعات
principles of good
بالسبل
neighborliness,
السلمية
and the peaceful settlement of disputes.
وتعرب عن
We
قلقها
express our
حيال
concern
هذا
over
التصعيد
this
الخطير
dangerous
الذي ينذر
escalation which
بتداعيات
warns
جسيمة على
of
أمن
grave
الشرق الأوسط.
consequences on the security of the region.
وتؤكد أيضا
Egypt confirms
على أهمية
the need
إخلاء منطقة
to rid
الشرق
the
الأوسط من
security
الأسلحة
the
النووية
Middle East
وغيرها
of
من
weapons
أسلحة الدمار
of
الشامل
mass
وفق
destruction
القرارات
and nuclear
الدولية ذات
weapons in
الصلة
accordance
ودون
with relevant
انتقائية
international resolutions
وتشدد على
with no
ضرورة
selectivity.
انضمام كافة
We stress
الدول
the need
المنطقة
that
إلى
all
معاهدة
countries in the
عدم
region
انتشار
must
الأسلحة
accede to the
النووية.
Non-Proliferation Treaty.
سيد الرئيس بإمكاننا
Mr.
أن
President,
نسرد مجددا
we can
الإحصائيات التي
list once
تدلل على
again the
كارثية الوضع
statistics
في
that
قطاع
reflect
غزة
the
وإجرام
catastrophic
العدوان
situation in
الإسرائيلي
Gaza, the
ولكننا قطعا
criminality
لا
of the
نحتاج
Israeli aggression. But
لأدلة
we
لإنقاذ
definitely do not
الفلسطينيين.
need further evidence
منا
to
بحاجة
justify saving the
لعرض صور
Palestinians.
الأطفال
Those of us
القتلى
who need to
والأمهات
see the
الثكلى
pictures of dead
وصور
children, of
المدنيين
grieving
وهم
mothers,
يحترقون
of civilians
لإيجاد ما
burning
يوقف هذه
alive,
المذبحة
to find
الماثلة أمام
a
الجميع
reason to put an
والتي
end
لا
to this
يمكن
massacre.
إنكارها بأي شكل.
And
استمرار ما يحدث
we do
في
not need these
غزة
pictures
عار
to put an end to this
على
massacre
المجتمع
that nobody
الدولي
can deny.
بأسره
What is happening in Gaza
وينبغي
is a
وقفه
source of
فورا.
shame to the international community
ختاما
as a whole,
سيد
and it must
الرئيس
be stopped
نطالب في سياق ما
immediately.
تقدم
In
أعضاء
closing,
الجمعية العامة
and
للأمم
in light of
المتحدة
the
باستمرار
above,
في
we ask the members of the
مواقفهم
General Assembly
النبيل
to continue in their noble
حقوق الشعب
position that
الفلسطيني
support the rights
وتأييد
of the
حق الشعب
Palestinian people,
الفلسطيني
that support the
في
rights of the
دولته
Palestinian people to have
المستقلة
their independent state,
وعاصمتها القدس الشرقية
with East Jerusalem as its
وإكسابها
capital,
العضوية
and
الكاملة
to
في
grant it
الأمم
full
المتحدة.
membership in the United
هذا هو
Nations.
السبيل
This is
الوحيد
the only
للسلام في
path to
المنطقة
peace in the region.
ولا سبيل
There is
سواه.
no other path.
لا مساحة للوقوف على
There
الحياد.
is no room
الصمت
to stand in
تواطؤ
neutrality
والتردد في دعم الحق
because silence
الفلسطيني
is
خيانة.
collusion and any
والتصويت
hesitation in
لصالح أي
supporting
مشروع
the Palestinian
قرار
rights is
قادم
treachery
يهدف
and
لإنقاذ
voting
المدنيين
in
في
favor
الأرض
of any draft
الفلسطينية
resolution
واجب
that aims
قانوني
to save
وضرورة
the civilians in the
أخلاقية.
Palestinian territories is
لا
a
تخذلوا
legal
الإنسانية.
obligation
كل
and a moral
شكر
necessity.
سيد الرئيس.
Do not let humanity down. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt. Now I give the floor to His Excellency Ivan Gil Pinto, Minister of People's Power for Foreign Relations of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, on behalf of a group of friends in defense of the Charter of the United Nations.
Señor Presidente, la
President,
República Bolivariana de
the
Venezuela
Bolivarian
tiene el
Republic
honor
of Venezuela
de hacer el uso de la palabra
has the honor
en
to take
nombre
the
del
floor
grupo de
on
amigos
behalf
en
of the group
defensa
of friends in
de la
defense of the
Carta
Charter
de
of
las
the
Naciones
United
Unidas.
Nations.
Señor Presidente,
President,
nos reunimos en esta asamblea
once again we
bajo
are gathered in this General
circunstancias que
Assembly
deberían
under
avergonzar la
circumstances that should
conciencia
shame the
colectiva de la
collective
humanidad.
conscience of humanity.
Una vez más, los Estados Unidos de
Once
América
again, the United States of
emitieron un voto
America
negativo en el Consejo de
cast
Seguridad
another
el
negative
pasado
vote at the Security
4 de
Council
junio de
on the 4th of June
2025 en
2025
relación con el proyecto de resolución
draft resolution
contenido en el documento S/2025/353, presentado
jointly
ante ese
submitted to
órgano
that
de manera
body by its
conjunta por sus
non-permanent
miembros no
members.
permanentes y a través del cual se
This,
buscaba exigir
among
un alto al fuego
other
inmediato, incondicional y
goals,
permanente,
sought to demand an immediate,
respetado
unconditional
por
and
todas las
permanent
partes en
ceasefire
el
respected
conflicto
by
en
all
curso
parties to
en
the
la Franja de
ongoing
Gaza.
conflict in the Gaza
Así
Strip,
como propiciar
and
el
also
acceso humanitario
immediately to
inmediato
provide
a
humanitarian
fin de
access
aliviar
to
la
alleviate
hambruna que
conditions of
continúa padeciendo
starvation
hoy la
being
población
suffered by the
civil
Palestinian
palestina.
civilian population.
En este contexto,
In this
condenamos el veto
context, we
emitido por el
condemn
gobierno de los
the
Estados Unidos de
veto
América,
used by the
que
government of the
continúa
United States,
obstruyendo la
which
acción del
continues to
Consejo de Seguridad,
obstruct the Security
lo
Council's
cual
action.
se constituye en una muestra de complicidad
This is further
para con las
complicity
políticas y
with
prácticas
Israel's
de Israel
policies
en el
and
territorio
practices in the
palestino
occupied Palestinian
ocupado,
territory,
incluida
including
Jerusalén
East
Oriental,
Jerusalem,
al permitir
by
repetidamente
repeatedly
que
preventing
dicho órgano
that body
cumpla con sus
from fulfilling its
responsabilidades
responsibilities
conforme
as
a la
provided
Carta de
for
Naciones
in
Unidas,
the UN Charter,
frustrando así los esfuerzos para
thus
poner fin a
thwarting
la
efforts to put
catastrófica
an end
crisis actual,
to the current
así
catastrophic
como a
crisis
esta
and to this
ocupación
illegal
ilegal en su
occupation as a
conjunto.
whole.
Se trata de un accionar deliberado que, en última instancia,
This is a
socava
deliberate
la paz,
action
la
which
seguridad
ultimately
y la
undermines
estabilidad
peace, security
del
and
Medio
stability
Oriente.
in the Middle East.
Este nuevo veto por
This
parte de
new
los
veto
Estados Unidos de
by the
América,
United States of
que ha
America
mantenido al Consejo de Seguridad paralizado
has kept the
a la hora de
Council
abordar
paralyzed
eficazmente
on
la ocupación
effectively
y
addressing
los crímenes de
Israel's
Israel en
ongoing
Palestina,
occupation and
representa
crimes
una señal de luz
in
verde para desencadenar
Palestine. It is a
más
green
violencia
light for
sobre el
further
terreno.
violence.
Por lo tanto, instamos
We therefore
una vez más al
urge
gobierno de los
the
Estados
government of the
Unidos de
United
América
States
a que ponga
to
fin a su
end
indiferencia
its
y a su
indifference
complicidad
and its complicity
ante el
in
sufrimiento
the
de la
suffering
población
of the
civil de la
civilian
Franja de Gaza
population in the
y a
Gaza
que
Strip,
ceda ante la abrumadora
and
mayoría
to
del
yield
mundo
to the
que
overwhelming
insiste
majority of the
en el
world,
Estado de Derecho
which
a nivel
insists
internacional
on the
y
rule
el
of law at
respeto
the
por
international
la
level
Carta
and
de las
respect for
Naciones
the United
Unidas y
Nations
el derecho
Charter and
internacional,
international
incluido
law,
el derecho
including
internacional
international
humanitario
humanitarian law
y el derecho
and
internacional
international
de
human
los
rights
derechos
law,
humanos, y a que se solidarice y apoye la
stands
justa
in
situación del
solidarity
pueblo palestino
and
y
support
sus
for the
derechos
just plight of the
inalienables.
Palestinian people
Señor
and their
Presidente,
inalienable
la
rights.
situación sobre el terreno va
President,
más
the
allá de lo
situation
crítico.
on the ground is
Las
beyond
condiciones y
critical.
tragedias para millones de personas continúan deteriorándose día a día.
The conditions
En
for
este
millions
contexto,
continue to
renovamos
deteriorate day
nuestra más grave
on day.
preocupación por las
We renew our
catastróficas
most serious
consecuencias,
concern about the
incluyendo en
catastrophic
el ámbito
consequences, including in the
humanitario, como
humanitarian
consecuencia
domain,
de la brutal operación
resulting
militar
from the
israelí
ongoing
en
brutal
curso y en los crímenes cometidos
Israeli
hasta la
military
fecha por
operation
la
and the
potencia
crimes committed to
ocupante
date by
en
the
contra del
occupying
pueblo
power
palestino.
against the Palestinian
En la
people.
Franja de Gaza,
In the Gaza
somos
Strip,
testigos de lo que
we
solo
are
puede
witnessing
describirse
what can
como
only
un
be
colapso de
described
las
as a
normas más
collapse
básicas
of the
del
most
derecho
basic
internacional
norms of
y del derecho
international law
internacional
and
humanitario.
international humanitarian law.
Más de 55,000
Over
palestinos, la gran
55,000
mayoría de ellos
Palestinians,
civiles,
the vast majority of them civilians,
mujeres,
including women
niñas
and
y
thousands
niños,
of children,
han sido
have been
asesinados,
killed,
mientras otros más de
while more than
125,000 han
125,000
resultado
others have been
heridos y
wounded,
toda la población
and the
ha
entire
quedado
population
traumatizada,
has been
casi
traumatized,
todos
nearly
además
all
desplazados
forcibly
a la
displaced.
fuerza. Barrios enteros
Entire
han sido
neighborhoods
arrasados,
have been flattened,
hospitales destruidos,
hospitals destroyed,
escuelas que debieron convertirse en
schools
refugio han sido
turned into
bombardeadas.
shelters, bombed.
El suministro de agua y
Water and
electricidad ha sido
electricity
cortado
deliberately cut off.
deliberadamente el agua y los
food
alimentos
and water
son retenidos.
withheld.
El derecho a la vida,
The right to
el
life,
más
the
fundamental de
most
todos los
fundamental of all
derechos,
rights,
está siendo
is being
tratado
treated
como
as
prescindible.
expendable.
Todo ello mientras
All of
Israel,
it,
la
while
potencia
Israel,
ocupante,
the occupying
viola sus
power,
obligaciones legales
violates
en
its
virtud
legal
del derecho
obligations under
internacional
international
humanitario,
humanitarian law,
incluso en lo que
including
respecta a la
with
facilitación de ayuda
regard to the
humanitaria
facilitation
para
of
todos los
humanitarian
civiles
relief
que
for
así
all
lo necesiten.
civilians who need it.
Señor presidente,
President,
más recientemente,
more recently,
hace tan solo un par de días,
just a couple of days
vimos
ago,
con horror,
we
una
witnessed
vez
with
más,
horror once
el ataque
again
de
the
las fuerzas
attack by
israelíes
Israeli forces
contra
on
civiles
civilians in
en
Gaza
Gaza que
seeking
esperaban
humanitarian
recibir
aid.
ayuda humanitaria. Y lo que es más
And
aún escandaloso,
what is even more
vimos
shocking,
el lanzamiento
we
de
saw the
supuestos
firing
disparos
of
de advertencia
so-called
contra
warning
agentes
shots
diplomáticos en
against
la ribera
diplomatic
occidental,
agents in the West
desafiando
Bank,
deliberadamente la
in
Convención
deliberate
de Viena
defiance of the
sobre
Vienna
relaciones
Convention on
diplomáticas.
Diplomatic Relations.
Como declaró en esa
As the
ocasión el
Secretary
secretario
General
general,
said,
esto es algo
this
verdaderamente
is
inaceptable. Ahora bien,
Genuinely
esto habla de la
unacceptable.
urgencia de redoblar todos los esfuerzos
This
internacionales
highlights the
para
need
avanzar de forma
urgently to
efectiva e
redouble
inmediata
international
hacia un
efforts to
necesario
effectively and
proceso de
immediately
rendición de cuentas
advance
por
towards a
todos los
much-needed
crímenes
process of
cometidos por
accountability
Israel,
for all
la
Israel's
potencia ocupante,
crimes, the crimes
contra los
committed
pueblos
by
de
the occupying
Palestina,
power,
del Líbano
against
y de
the
otras
peoples of
nacionalidades,
Palestine,
en el
Lebanon,
que se
and
espera
other
que
nationalities,
todos los mecanismos
in which
pertinentes de la
all
justicia
relevant
internacional
mechanisms of international
desempeñen un
justice are
papel
expected to play
responsable
a
para
responsible
poner fin
role
al ciclo de
to put an
impunidad
end to the prevailing
imperante
cycle of
que no ha hecho
impunity,
sino
which has only
envalentonar al régimen israelí
emboldened
para
Israel,
perpetuar en el tiempo
the
sus
occupying
políticas
power,
y sus
to
prácticas
perpetuate over time
criminales
its
contra
criminal
los pueblos
policies
de
and
la región.
practices against the people of the
Más
region.
gravemente contra el
Most
pueblo
gravely
palestino
against the
durante más de
Palestinian people for more than
77 años desde
77
el inicio de la
years
Nakba
since the
y ahora
onset of
durante
the
más de
Nakba,
58
and
años
now
de
for over
ocupación
58 years
militar
of military
desde
occupation since
1967.
1967.
Señor presidente,
President,
reiteramos
we
que
reiterate
no
that there
existe
is
ninguna
no
justificación
legal,
legal,
moral,
moral
or political
o política
justification
para la matanza
for the
indiscriminada
indiscriminate
de
killing of
civiles,
civilians,
incluidas
including
mujeres,
women and children.
niñas y niños. Tampoco existe
Nor is
base
there
legal o
any
moral
legal or
para
moral
bloquear los
basis
esfuerzos
for
de las
blocking
Naciones
the
Unidas
efforts of the
orientados a
United
evitar
Nations
un mayor
to
derramamiento de
prevent
sangre
further
y poner
bloodshed
fin
and to
al
end the
bloqueo en
blockade
la
in
franja
the
de
Gaza
Gaza.
Strip.
Por tanto,
Therefore,
hacemos
we can
hincapié
only
en la importancia de la
emphasize the
implementación
importance of
plena
the
y
full and
efectiva
effective
del acuerdo
implementation
del
of
alto
the
al fuego
ceasefire
alcanzado
agreement
previamente.
previously reached.
Además está decir
Needless to
que
say,
resulta de suma
it
importancia
is of utmost
avanzar en
importance
todos
to
los ámbitos
advance
del
in all
acuerdo
fields
de
of
alto
the
al fuego,
ceasefire
así como las
agreement,
resoluciones
as well as relevant
pertinentes
UN
de la
resolutions,
Organización de Naciones Unidas, para preservar un
in order to
horizonte
preserve a
político
political
que,
horizon
en última instancia,
that can
pueda
ultimately lead us
conducirnos
to the
al
comprehensive
definitivo final de
end
este prolongado
to
y
this
doloroso
protracted
conflicto
and
y a la
disastrous
justicia
conflict
para
and
sus
justice for
innumerables
its
víctimas.
countless victims.
Del mismo modo, aprovechamos esta oportunidad para insistir en que
Similarly,
el
we
Consejo de
must
Seguridad de las
insist that
Naciones
the
Unidas debe
UN
asumir
Security
sus
Council must
responsabilidades,
shoulder its responsibilities,
incluso sobre la base de las
including on the basis
disposiciones
of the relevant
pertinentes
provisions of Chapter
del
7
capítulo
of the
7
UN
de la
Charter.
Carta de Naciones Unidas, y debe también garantizar
The Council must
sus
also ensure
resoluciones
that its
sobre la
resolutions
cuestión
on
de
the question of
Palestina
Palestine
sean
are
respetadas
both fully
e
respected
implementadas
and implemented.
plenamente. Insistimos en este orden
The time
que ha llegado el
has
momento
come
de que el Consejo
for
de
the
Seguridad de
Security
las
Council
Naciones
to
Unidas
adopt a
adopte una resolución
resolution
que exija
demanding
un
an
alto al fuego
immediate
inmediato
and
y
permanent
permanente,
ceasefire,
respetado por todas las partes,
respected by
que
all
permita el
parties,
acceso
that would allow for
humanitario sin
unimpeded
trabas, de
humanitarian
forma coherente,
access,
segura
consistently,
y a escala,
safely, and
y
to
que de
scale,
todo y de que todos los miembros
as well as for
responsables
all
de la comunidad
responsible members of the
internacional
international community
adopten medidas
to take
urgentes
urgent
dentro de los
measures
poderes que le
within the powers
confiere la
conferred
Carta
upon
de
it by
Naciones
the UN
Unidas,
Charter,
orientadas a poner
aimed
fin al
at ceasing the
suministro o la
provision or
transferencia de
transfer of
armas,
arms,
municiones
munitions, and
y
related
equipo
equipment
conexo
to
a Israel,
Israel,
la potencia
the
ocupante,
occupying power.
en todos aquellos
In all
casos
cases
en los
where
que
there are
existan
reasonable
motivos
grounds to
razonables para
suspect
sospechar
that
que
they may
estos
be
puedan
used in the
utilizarse en el
occupied
territorio
Palestinian
palestino
territory,
ocupado, teniendo en cuenta
as
lo
stipulated in
dispuesto
GA
en la resolución ES-10/24 de la Asamblea General aprobada el 18 de septiembre de 2024. Señor presidente,
President,
hacemos además
we call
un llamado a la comunidad
also on the
internacional
international
para que
community
adopte
to take
medidas
effective
eficaces para
action
obligar a Israel,
to compel
la
Israel,
potencia
the
ocupante,
occupying power,
a adherirse al
to
derecho
adhere to
internacional,
international law,
incluso mediante la denuncia continua del doble rasero y la selectividad que imperan en la aplicación de la Carta de Naciones Unidas y del derecho internacional, incluido el derecho internacional humanitario, y mediante la denuncia de que este doble rasero menospreciaría menoscaba gravemente la credibilidad de los Estados que insisten en proteger las acciones ilegales y criminales de Israel, así como la legitimidad de las instituciones multilaterales. Dicho todo lo anterior, y en consonancia con nuestras posiciones históricas y de principio, aprovechamos esta oportunidad para renovar tanto nuestro firme compromiso con la justa causa de Palestina, así como nuestra inquebrantable solidaridad con el pueblo palestino en su lucha permanente por hacer realidad sus derechos inalienables, incluyendo la libertad y la justicia. Reafirmamos además nuestro pleno y continuo apoyo a todos los esfuerzos encaminados a poner fin a la grave injusticia infligida al pueblo palestino desde la Nakba de 1948. Seguimos, asimismo, comprometidos a redoblar nuestros esfuerzos para poner fin a la ocupación ilegal israelí y para lograr la independencia del Estado palestino con Jerusalén Oriental, Al-Quds, Al-Sharif como su capital. La realización de los derechos inalienables del pueblo palestino, incluidos el de la autodeterminación y la libertad, y una solución justa, integral y duradera a la cuestión palestina en todos sus aspectos, incluida la difícil situación de los refugiados de Palestina y la realización de su derecho al retorno, de conformidad con el derecho internacional, las resoluciones pertinentes de la Organización de Naciones Unidas y la Carta de Naciones Unidas, y sobre la base de la solución de dos estados que permita la realización de la independencia de un Estado palestino soberano y viable sobre la base de la frontera previa a 1967 y con Jerusalén Este como su capital. Por otra parte, expresamos también nuestra determinación de no permitir que se normalice la actual situación en el territorio palestino ocupado, incluido Jerusalén Este, y muy especialmente en la Franja de Gaza, así como en el Líbano, de no permitir que se normalice la violencia desatada por Israel, la potencia ocupada. En este contexto, exigimos una vez más al gobierno de Estados Unidos de América, en su calidad de miembro permanente del Consejo de Seguridad, que deje de lado sus cálculos políticos, pues ha sido este el que ha mantenido ese órgano rehén de una parálisis que, entre otras cosas, ha envalentonado a Israel para continuar con sus políticas de apartheid y exterminio en contra del pueblo palestino. En estos graves tiempos, permanecer en silencio ante la violencia brutal de Palestina es ser cómplice. Esta no es una opción. La integridad de las Naciones Unidas y, de hecho, el futuro del mismo multilateralismo dependen de nuestro valor colectivo para defender su carta sin excepciones ni selectividad. Hacemos un llamado, pues, a todos los Estados miembros para que actúen no por conveniencia política, sino por sentido de la justicia, responsabilidad y humanidad hacia todo un pueblo que ha sufrido y ha resistido esta grave injusticia con la máxima dignidad durante ya demasiado tiempo. Ahora es el momento de hacer realidad para ello la promesa contenida en la propia Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Por último, reiteramos nuestro apoyo a los esfuerzos responsables realizados por esta Asamblea General para hacer frente y, en última instancia, poner fin a esta tragedia que se está infligiendo en contra del pueblo palestino. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
I thank the Minister of People's Power for Foreign Relations of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Qatar.
Mr. President, allow me at the outset to thank you for resuming this emergency special session. We welcome the adoption of resolution titled Protection of Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations regarding the situation in Gaza Strip. We align ourselves with the statement on behalf of GCC member states, the Arab Group, and the non-aligned movement. Mr. President, the need to resume this session is due to the unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza Strip that requires this General Assembly to shoulder its responsibility towards the Palestinian question in line with the UN Charter. The Israeli occupation resumed its aggression despite a ceasefire agreement that was concluded through efforts made by Qatar, Egypt, and the US last January. The diplomatic efforts achieved several important steps from the beginning in responding to the humanitarian catastrophe and suffering. Therefore, Qatar is keen on continuing to intensify the mediation efforts to overcome those obstacles in the negotiations towards reaching a permanent ceasefire agreement to allow the end of a humanitarian crisis, the opening of the crossing, the entry of humanitarian aid, and ultimately end the war and start reconstruction. Qatar rejects categorically the ongoing Israeli attacks on civilian assets, including hospitals, schools, and communities. It rejects also the use of food as a weapon of war and the starvation of civilians, calls upon the international community to oblige Israel to ensure the safe, sustainable, unhindered entry of humanitarian aid. We reiterate that the forcible displacement of Palestinians in any form or shape is a blatant violation of international humanitarian law. The expansion of settlement is also a blatant violation of international resolutions, and therefore the state of Qatar strongly condemns the occupation authorities' approval to build new settlements in the occupied West Bank. It also condemns the repeated attempts to undermine the historic and religious status of Al-Aqsa Mosque. We refuse categorically all Israeli actions to end the role of UNRWA. We reaffirm the need to support UNRWA to implement its mandate authorized by this General Assembly. Mr. President, Qatar warned repeatedly of the repercussions of the ongoing and continuation of the war in Gaza Strip to the region, and that the escalatory policies of the Israeli occupation will inevitably lead to a spillover of the violence and chaos in the region. In light of the current escalation in the region, Qatar strongly condemns and deplores the Israeli attack on the sisterly Iran. We consider it a blatant violation of Iran's sovereignty and security and a blatant violation of the rules and principles of international law. We express our grave concern regarding this dangerous escalation that threatens the peace and stability of the region and obstructs efforts that aim at de-escalation and reaching diplomatic solutions. Qatar reiterates its unwavering position that rejects all forms of violence, calls for self-restraint and to avoid escalation that would lead to a spillover of this conflict and the undermining of peace and stability in the region. Mr. President, the time has come to take a real measures to support the peaceful settlement of the Palestinian question in line with international resolutions and the two-state solution, to allow the establishment of the State of Palestine while reiterating the right of the State of Palestine to full membership of the UN. In this regard, we look forward to the resumption of the high-level international conference for a peaceful settlement of the Palestinian question and the implementation of the two-state solution, co-chaired by Saudi Arabia and France, as soon as possible, which would be an opportunity to take collective steps to support this solution and achieve sustainable peace and stability regionally and internationally. We reiterate our unwavering position to support the just cause of the Palestinian cause and that the Palestinian people should obtain their legitimate rights, including the establishment of independent state on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Qatar, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
President, Ireland would like to thank you for convening this emergency special session of the General Assembly, and we also thank Spain for bringing forward this very important resolution. Ireland co-sponsored and voted in favour of the resolution. It is deeply regrettable that the Security Council was unable to agree a resolution put forward by the elected members of the Council on the 4th of June, which called for an immediate, unconditional and permanent ceasefire, the immediate, dignified and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other groups, as well as the immediate and unconditional lifting of all restrictions on the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza. We also recall the defeat of a similar draft resolution of the Security Council on the 20th of November last year. It is clear that the Security Council, and by extension the international community, has failed to act to end hostilities in Gaza and to secure a release of the hostages, who are now in captivity for over 600 days. Ireland calls on the international community to enable the development of a lasting ceasefire and a sustainable peace agreement, which secures a future where Israel and Palestine can live side by side in peace and security. The result of last week's vote demonstrates that the international community is united in its desire for an unconditional and permanent ceasefire, the dignified and unconditional release of hostages, and for the immediate, unimpeded supply of humanitarian aid into Gaza, all in accordance with international law and humanitarian principles. UN and humanitarian organisations must be allowed to work independently and to do their job. UNRWA remains the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza. Actions to undermine the implementation of its mandate should be rejected. President, history will reflect our failings. A failure to respond to this moment is a rebuke to multilateralism, to international law, and to the universal applicability of human rights across the world. Let us be in no doubt that we are in the most difficult stage of the past 20 months of this conflict. 53 hostages remain in captivity, their families tormented further with each passing day. Military efforts have not brought them home. A return to diplomatic talks is imperative. Over 55,000 people have been killed in Gaza, with many more people unaccounted for under the rubble. The majority of deaths verified are women and children, innocent civilians. Most people in Gaza have been forcibly displaced multiple times, some up to 20 times. They have relocated to places where there is insufficient humanitarian aid, a lack of shelter, water, sanitation, food and medical supplies. Many are already sick and injured, and 500,000 people face starvation. This desperate situation is unacceptable. It cannot be allowed to continue. There needs to be urgent action. The Security Council was unable to act. However, this Assembly has spoken. Each of the 150 votes cast in favour of this resolution was a vote for humanity, for international law and international humanitarian law, a vote for the safety of our humanitarian workers, and for peace and stability for Israel and Palestine, and a vote for long-lasting regional peace. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ireland, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia.
In
the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, Mr. President, allow me at the outset to thank you for responding to the request to resume the emergency special session of the General Assembly. In this regard, we align ourselves with the statement delivered by Cameroon on behalf of OIC member states, Yemen on behalf of the Arab group, Kuwait on behalf of GCC member states, and Uganda on behalf of the non-aligned movement. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, we stand here today yet again before a painful reality that is reflected in the obstruction of international efforts at the Security Council through the use of the veto right. After almost 80 years since the establishment of the UN, we continue to see this arbitrary use of this right that will prevent the Security Council to shoulder its responsibilities, namely in safeguarding international peace and security. What the Gaza Strip is witnessing in terms of horrifying humanitarian tragedies
is
ولا
a
يمكن
stain
تبريرها
on the
تحت
conscience
أي
of
ظرف.
humanity and cannot be justified
السيد
under any
الرئيس إن
circumstances.
مطالب
Mr.
المجتمع الدولي
President, ladies
واضحة
and gentlemen,
جلية
the demands of the
تتمثل
international
في وقف
community
إطلاق النار
are very
دائم
clear,
وغير مشروط
namely
يحترمه
a
جميع
permanent
الأطراف
unconditional ceasefire
وإطلاق
respected by all
سراح الرهائن
parties, the
المحتجزين
release of the
والرفع الفوري وغير
hostages,
المشروط
the
لجميع
immediate
القيود
and
المفروضة على
unconditional
دخول
lifting of
المساعدات
all
الإنسانية
restrictions
إلى قطاع
on the
غزة
entry of aid to
وتوزيعها
Gaza,
بشكل
to distribute aid
آمن
in a
ودون
safe
عوائق
manner,
بالإضافة
unhindered, in
لاستعداد جميع
addition to the
استعادة جميع
resumption
الخدمات
of all
الأساسية
the
في القطاع.
basic services in
إن
Gaza
هذه
Strip.
الدعوات
These calls
تجسد مطالب إنسانية جوهرية
basic
تعكس
humanitarian
الالتزام
demands that
بالكرامة
are also
البشرية والحقوق
reflective of
الأساسية.
the commitment to human
السيد
dignity
الرئيس
and
إن
basic
العدوان
rights.
الوحشي
Mr.
الممنهج
President,
ضد
the
الشعب الفلسطيني
systematic brutal
بقطاع
aggression
غزة
against the
والضفة
Palestinian people in
الغربية قد
Gaza
أدى
Strip
إلى
and the West
دمار
Bank
شامل
had
للبنى
led to a
التحتية
comprehensive
وأسفر عن
destruction of the
معاناة
infrastructure and
إنسانية
led
كبرى
to
في
a
ظل
grave
استخدام التجويع
humanitarian suffering
كأداة حرب
when
وفرض
starvation is
حصار
used as a
جائر
weapon of
يمنع
war
دخول
and there is an
المساعدات
imposition of an
الإنسانية
unjust
والمواد
siege
الإغاثية
that prevents the
واستخدامها
entry of humanitarian
كأداة
aid and
للابتزاز
that are
والعقاب
used.
الجماعي
Humanitarian aid is used
مما
as
يعد
a
انتهاكا
weapon for
صارخا للقانون
blackmail and
الدولي
collective punishment.
ومساسا
This
مباشرا
is a blatant
بقواعد
violation of
القانون الدولي
international
الإنساني
law
ويستمر هذا
and
العدوان
the principles of
بالتوازي
international
مع
humanitarian
استمرار
law. This
السياسات
continues in
الاستيطانية غير
parallel
القانونية
with the ongoing
التي تنتهجها
illegal
سلطات
settlement
الاحتلال
policies by the
الإسرائيلي
Israeli occupation
وتوسع
authorities
دائرة
that
العنف في
expand also
المنطقة
the cycle of violence in the
وتعطيل
region
إسرائيل
and Israel's
وعرقلتها لأي
obstructions
جهود
of any
تبذل
efforts
وزيارات
that are made
دبلوماسية
and
تسعى
any
لتحقيق
diplomatic
السلام.
visits that seek to achieve
وختاما
peace.
السيد
In
الرئيس
conclusion,
السيدات
Mr.
والسادة
President, ladies
تؤكد
and
المملكة
gentlemen,
العربية
the
السعودية على
Kingdom of Saudi
موقفها الثابت
Arabia
والداعم
reiterates
للقضية
its
الفلسطينية
unwavering support
وحقوق
to the
الشعب
Palestinian
الفلسطيني
question and the
بإقامة
rights of the
دولته
Palestinian people to
الفلسطينية
establish
المستقلة
their
وذات
independent
السيادة على حدود
sovereign
الرابع من
Palestinian
يونيو
state
عام
on the 4th of June 1967
1967
borders
وعاصمتها
with
القدس
its capital
الشرقية
East
وفقا
Jerusalem in
لقرارات
line with
الشرعية
international
الدولية
resolutions
ومبادرة السلام
and the Arab
العربية
Peace
وعلى
Initiative
أساس
and on the
حل
basis of the
الدولتين
two-state solution.
ومواصلة بذلك الجهود
We continue
والتواصل
our
مع الدول
efforts and our
الشقيقة
communication
والصديقة
with brotherly
لإيجاد
and
حل
friendly
عاجل
countries
وعملي
to find
يوقف
a
نزيف
quick
الدم
and
ويضع
practical
حدا
solution to stop
للتصعيد
the bloodshed
وينهي
and put
دورات
an end
العنف
to this
المستمرة
escalation and the
والمتزايدة
ongoing
إيمانا
cycles of
منا
violence
بأن السلام
because we
العادل
believe
والشامل
that
والدائم
just,
هو
comprehensive
الخيار
and permanent peace
الاستراتيجي
is the
الضامن
strategic
لأمن
option
واستقرار
that will
المنطقة
guarantee the
وشكرا.
stability and security of the region. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lebanon.
السيد الرئيس، ينضم وفد بلادي إلى البيان الملقى من سعادة المندوب اليمني باسم المجموعة العربية. نجتمع اليوم مجددا في الدورة الاستثنائية الطارئة العاشرة المستأنفة في وقت يستمر فيه الحصار على غزة مفاقما معاناة شعب يكابد يوميا أقصى أشكال العنف والحرمان وبعد أن فشل مجلس الأمن بوضع حد لهذه الكارثة اللا إنسانية ها نحن اليوم في الجمعية العامة نلتئم لنقول لغزة وأهلها
Gaza and its people, you are
ونحن
not
معكم.
alone, and we stand
السيد
here with you,
الرئيس
Mr. President.
يدعم لبنان مشروع
Lebanon
القرار
supports the
المقدم من
draft
إسبانيا
resolution that was
ومجموعة من
submitted by
الدول
Spain
حول
and a
الحالة
number of groups
الإنسانية في
regarding
غزة
the humanitarian situation in
وينضم
Gaza
إلى
Strip.
الدعوة
We
لوقف
join
فوري
the call
وغير
for an
مشروط
immediate
لإطلاق النار في
unconditional
غزة
ceasefire in Gaza
ولإدخال
Strip and
المساعدات
for
الإنسانية
the
فورا إلى
immediate
القطاع
entry of humanitarian aid into
كما
Gaza
يجدد
Strip.
دعمه
It
للخطة العربية
renews its
الإسلامية
support for the Arab
لإعادة
and
إعمار غزة
Islamic plan for the
ويهم
reconstruction
لبنان
of Gaza Strip.
التأكيد على أن
Lebanon
ما
would like to
يحدث اليوم
reiterate
في
that what is
غزة
happening
وفي
today
سائر
in Gaza
الأراضي
Strip
الفلسطينية
and all
المحتلة
the occupied
لا يمكن
Palestinian
فصله
territory
عن جوهر
cannot
الصراع
be separated from
ويشدد
the
لبنان
essence
على
of this
ضرورة
conflict,
التوصل
and
إلى
Lebanon
سلام
reiterates the
عادل
need to
وثابت في
achieve a
المنطقة
just and permanent
يسمح للشعب
peace in the
الفلسطيني
region that would allow the
بإقامة
Palestinian
دولته
people to
المستقلة
establish their
وفق
independent
قرارات
state
الشرعية
in line with
الدولية ذات
international
الصلة
relevant
ويضمن
international
حق
resolutions
اللاجئين
that
بالعودة
guarantees the right of
ويعطي كل
refugees
بلدان
to
المنطقة
return
وشعوبها
and gives all the
حقوقها
countries and
المحقة
peoples of the region
والمشروعة.
their due rights and their
السيد
legitimate
الرئيس
rights.
يتطلع
Mr.
لبنان
President,
إلى إعادة
Lebanon
تحديد
looks
موعد
forward to
لانعقاد
the
المؤتمر الدولي
rescheduling of the
لتسوية القضية
international conference for the
الفلسطينية
settlement
وحل
of the
الدولتين
Palestinian question
برئاسة
and the implementation
المملكة
of the
العربية
two-state
السعودية
solution
وفرنسا.
co-chaired by Saudi
كما يدعو
Arabia
لبنان
and
المجتمع
France.
الدولي
Lebanon
إلى
calls
الارتقاء إلى
the
مستوى
international
التحديات
community to rise
التي
up
تفرضها
to
هذه
the
اللحظة
extent
التاريخية
of challenges
وإلى
posed by this
اتخاذ
historic
خطوات ملموسة
moment and to
وعملية
take concrete
للدفع
and
قدما
practical steps to
بتنفيذ
push
قرارات
forward
الأمم
in terms of the
المتحدة
full implementation of
المتعلقة
UN
بقضية
resolutions
فلسطين
related to the
وحل
Palestinian
الدولتين
question and
من
the
أجل
two-state
تحقيق
solution
سلام
in order
عادل
to achieve a
ودائم
just and
وشامل
permanent
في
and
الشرق الأوسط.
comprehensive peace in the
السيد
Middle
الرئيس
East. Mr.
في
President,
حين نركز
at
في
a time
الدورة اليوم
where we focus
على الوضع
today
في
on
غزة
the situation
يهمنا
in
التشديد
Gaza,
على
it
أن
is
لبنان
important to
لا يزال
reiterate
يرزح
that
تحت
Lebanon
الاعتداءات
continues to
الإسرائيلية
suffer
على
Israeli
سيادته
aggressions
وعلى أرضه.
against its sovereignty
وكان
and its
آخرها
territories,
الاعتداء على
the latest
ضاحية
of which
بيروت
was the attack
عشية عيد
on
الأضحى
the
المبارك
Dahya
وذلك
on the eve of
بانتهاك
Al-Adha
صارخ بالقرار 1701
on the eve of the
ولإعلان وقف
Al-Adha Eid
الأعمال
in
العدائية.
violation of Resolution
من هنا
1701 and the
نجدد
agreement
الدعوة
to
إلى
stop the
المجتمع
hostilities.
الدولي
Therefore,
لتحمل
we renew
مسؤولياته
our call to the international
والتحرك
community
الجاد
to shoulder its
والفعال من
responsibilities
أجل
and to
وضع
act
حد
quickly
لسياسة
to put an
الإفلات من
end to
العقاب
this policy of
والضغط على
impunity
إسرائيل
and to
لردعها
pressure
عن
Israel
النهج
to deter
القائم
it
على
from
العنف
its
الممنهج.
approach that is
كما
based on
نؤكد على
systematic
أهمية
violence.
احترام
We
القانون الدولي
reiterate the need to respect
بما في ذلك
international law,
القانون الدولي
including the
الإنساني
international
وقانون حقوق
humanitarian law
الإنسان
and the international human
والامتثال
rights law,
الكامل
and to fully
بقرارات مجلس
comply
الأمن
with Security
والجمعية العامة
Council
ذات الصلة
resolutions
والتي
and
تشكل
relevant
الإطار
General Assembly
القانوني
resolutions
والسياسي
that are the legal
لجهود
and
تحقيق
political
السلام
framework for
العادل
the efforts to
والدائم
achieve
في
just and
منطقتنا.
lasting peace in
وشكرا
our
السيد
region.
الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lebanon, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Algeria. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Namibia.
Mr. President, thank you for reconvening the 10th Emergency Special Session on illegal Israeli actions in the occupied East Jerusalem and the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory. The resumption of this emergency session of the General Assembly serves as a symbol of unity in maintaining international peace and security while building on prior actions taken by the United Nations General Assembly to end the illegal occupation by Israel of the occupied Palestinian territory. Mr. President, in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. Its opening statement reads, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights." Ironically, 1948 also marked the beginning of the Nakba. Many Palestinians born after 1948 cannot relate to the notion of being born free and equal in rights and dignity. Since 1948, prolonged occupation and dispossession of land and property through settlement expansion and annexation of territories has characterized the lives of Palestinians. In recent years, this has been expounded on by brutal attacks on civilians and their properties, resulting in worrisome humanitarian situation, especially in Gaza. All this in the face of a deteriorating humanitarian situation, which against the prescripts of international humanitarian law is characterized by constant attacks on civilians and their properties, mass displacement, crisis-level food shortages, which underpin critical famine risk and an acute shortage of medical supplies. Mr. President, the right to self-determination is affirmed by the International Court of Justice as jus cogens, a peremptory norm of international law from which there can be no derogation. Namibia's long-standing and unwavering support for the right for the Palestinian people to exercise their right to self-determination is underpinned by support for this internationally affirmed universal principle. At a time when the Security Council continues to be incapable of carrying out its primary responsibility to maintain international peace and security, the General Assembly and its representative nature is once again called upon to assert itself, this time with a particular focus on the protection of civilians and upholding legal and humanitarian obligations. At a time when brutal attacks on civilians and a continuation of the use of starvation as a method of war reigns supreme, there is an onerous responsibility for the General Assembly to protect the civilian population in Gaza. Protect them from the failure of international law, genocide, famine, harm, injury, and dispossession, and protect them from the continued expansion of settlements and further annexation of their territory. The impunity enjoyed by Israel is a blithe disregard for the guardrails of international law, which should shield the most vulnerable from the daily brutality they endure in the occupied Palestinian territory. Namibia has co-sponsored and voted in favor of the resolution A/ES/10/L34/Rev1, as we believe this resolution strongly supports the continued efforts of the General Assembly to bring to a permanent end the prolonged and illegal occupation by Israel, and forge forward with our broader affirmed goal of a two-state solution in line with numerous UN resolutions. This Assembly must continue to use its convening power as a force for good, and in line with the precepts of the Charter, reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations, large and small, and establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. In conclusion, Mr. President, Namibia will continue to call for an immediate, unconditional ceasefire in Gaza, the recognition and full membership of Palestine to the United Nations, and a renewed vision of a two-state solution that will enable the reconstruction of Gaza, leading to an independent Palestinian state, a safe Israel, and a durable peace in the Middle East. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Namibia, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland.
Président, Excellences, chers collègues, nous reprenons cette 10e session extraordinaire aujourd'hui alors que l'escalade entre Israël et l'Iran se poursuit et aggrave l'instabilité régionale. La Suisse est profondément préoccupée par ces développements et condamne tout recours à la force contraire au droit international, y compris à la Charte des Nations Unies. Alors que des victimes civiles sont rapportées, elle appelle les parties au strict respect du droit international humanitaire, notamment à la protection des civils et à faire preuve de la plus grande retenue. Le retour à la voie du dialogue est urgent. Parallèlement, les souffrances humaines au Proche-Orient et en particulier dans la bande de Gaza restent insupportables. Il faut y mettre fin sans plus attendre. C'est pourquoi nous avons soutenu la résolution adoptée par cette Assemblée jeudi passé et demandant sa mise en œuvre immédiate. En effet, la situation humanitaire ne cesse de s'aggraver à Gaza, où la population est confrontée à un risque critique de la famine. Par cette nouvelle résolution, une très grande majorité des États membres de l'ONU a rappelé son exigence d'un accès humanitaire sûr, rapide, durable et sans entrave à tous les civils dans le besoin à Gaza, un cessez-le-feu immédiat, inconditionnel et permanent, ainsi que la libération immédiate et inconditionnelle de tous les otages détenus par le Hamas. La Suisse condamne fermement toute violation du droit international humanitaire. Dès le 7 octobre 2023, la Suisse a condamné les actes de terreur ainsi que la prise et la détention d'otages par le Hamas. Nous nous félicitons que la résolution comprenne une condamnation explicite des
We
attaques à
welcome the fact that
l'encontre
the
des
resolution
civils, y
clearly
compris les
condemns
actes de
attacks on
terrorisme et les
civilians,
attaques
including
indiscriminées.
acts of terrorism and
Le principe
indiscriminate
de
attacks.
distinction
The
ancré
principle
dans le droit
of
international
distinction
humanitaire
rooted in
exige que les
international
civils
humanitarian
soient
law
en tout temps
requires
protégés
for
des effets
civilians
des
to be
conflits armés.
protected
Il
from the
couvre
effects of
notamment
armed conflicts at
l'interdiction des
all
attaques
times. It
indiscriminées
also includes a
ainsi que
ban on
l'usage de la
indiscriminate
présence de
attacks,
civils
as well as the
pour
use of the
éviter qu'un
presence of
objectif militaire ne devienne la
civilians
cible d'une attaque.
as
La
a way
Suisse
of preventing
rappelle que
civilian
toutes les
objects
parties
being
sont en
attacked.
toutes circonstances tenues de respecter leurs
Switzerland calls on all
obligations
parties under
en
all
vertu du droit
circumstances
international,
to
en
respect their
particulier
duties
du
under
droit
international
international humanitaire,
law,
même en
especially international
l'absence de
humanitarian law,
réciprocité.
even in
En
the
tant que
absence of
puissance
reciprocity.
occupante et conformément aux
The
conventions de
occupying power,
Genève,
in keeping with the
Israël
Geneva
porte une
Convention,
responsabilité particulière
Israel
pour la
has a
protection des
particular
civils.
duty
La Suisse
to
rappelle
afford
aussi que les
civilians
droits
protection.
humains, notamment le droit
Switzerland
à la
would also
vie,
like to recall
à
that human rights,
l'intégrité et à la
especially the right
dignité
to
humaine,
life,
doivent être strictement respectés,
dignity
y compris
and human life should
en
be
période de
strictly
conflit
upheld,
armé.
including
La
in
Suisse se
times of armed
félicite que la
conflict.
résolution
Switzerland
mette un
welcomes
accent
that the
particulier
resolution
sur l'obligation
emphasizes
de protéger le personnel humanitaire,
the obligation to
y
protect
compris le
humanitarian
personnel
personnel,
national
including
et recruté
national
localement,
humanitarian workers
comme
and
le
locally
rappelle la
recruited workers,
résolution
as
2730 du
recalled
Conseil de
by
sécurité.
Resolution
Nous avons
2730
exprimé à
adopted by
plusieurs
the Security
reprises
Council. On
notre
numerous occasions,
consternation
we
face
expressed
aux
our
nombreuses
dismay
attaques contre les
at
humanitaires,
the
ainsi
growing
que
number of
contre les
humanitarian
convois ou les
attacks on
infrastructures
humanitarians, as
humanitaires à
well as
Gaza.
humanitarian
Nous
convoys
condamnons
and
toute
humanitarian
attaque de
infrastructure
ce
in
type,
Gaza.
y
We
compris
condemn
par Israël.
all such attacks, including those
Enfin, la
waged by
Suisse
Israel.
accueille
Last but not
positivement
least,
l'accent que la
Switzerland
résolution met
welcomes
sur la
the
situation
fact that the
alarmante en
resolution
Cisjordanie
stresses
et les
the alarming
violations qui ont
situation
lieu
in
dans
the
ce
West
contexte.
Bank.
Monsieur le Président,
events there.
la Suisse réaffirme son attachement
President,
à une
Switzerland
paix
would like to
juste et
reiterate its
durable
commitment to a
dans la
just and
région,
lasting peace
fondée sur la
throughout the
solution à
region,
deux États et le droit
based on
international.
the two-state solution
Cette
and
solution
international
reste la
law.
seule option
This
possible
solution is the
pour Israéliens
only
et Palestiniens
possible
de vivre
option
côte à
for
côte
Israel
en
and
paix,
Palestine to
en
live
sécurité
side
et
by
dans la
side in peace and
dignité,
security
à
and in
l'intérieur de
dignity
frontières sûres et
within
reconnues,
safe and recognized,
conformément au
secure and
droit
recognized borders
international
in keeping with
et aux
international
paramètres
law
convenus au
and
niveau
the parameters
international.
agreed at the
Ainsi,
international
nous
level.
regrettons que la conférence
Thus,
pour
we
le
regret
règlement pacifique de la
that
question de
the
Palestine,
Conference for
la
the
mise en
Peaceful
œuvre de la
Settlement of the
solution
question
des deux États
Palestine
ait
and
dû
the
être
implementation of the
reportée à
two-state
la
solution
lumière
has
des
been
développements
postponed
régionaux.
owing to
Nous soutenons
the
sa
latest regional
tenue à une
developments.
date prochaine.
We hope that
En
it will
attendant,
be
la Suisse
held
exhorte
in
tous les acteurs
the near
à
future.
utiliser les
In the
canaux
meantime, we
diplomatiques
urge
existants
all actors
et
to
à
use
s'engager
existing
de
diplomatic
manière
channels and
constructive
to
pour contribuer à la
commit in a constructive
désescalade
fashion to
régionale,
contributing
ainsi
to
qu'au
regional
Proche-Orient et
de-escalation,
ainsi prévenir des
as well as in the Middle
conséquences
East, and
dévastatrices
also to
encore
prevent
plus graves.
the
La Suisse,
any
y
further
compris à
devastating
travers ses bons
consequences from coming
offices,
to pass.
reste à disposition
Switzerland will use its good
pour
offices
appuyer
and
tous
stands
ses
ready to
efforts en ce
support
sens.
all
Je vous
efforts
remercie.
aimed at this end. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Switzerland. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of United Arab Emirates.
سيد الرئيس، أود في البداية أن أتقدم لكم بالشكر على الاستجابة السريعة لدعوة المجموعة العربية ومنظمة التعاون الإسلامي لاستئناف الدورة الاستثنائية الطارئة العاشرة للجمعية العامة. وأضم صوتي إلى البيانات التي ألقيت نيابة عن المجموعتين الخليجية والعربية وحركة عدم الانحياز. إن انعقاد هذه الجلسة يأتي في ظروف بالغة الخطورة، حيث يشهد قطاع غزة كارثة إنسانية تتفاقم يوما بعد يوم. فمنذ استئناف إسرائيل لعملياتها العسكرية في مارس الماضي، تحولت غزة مجددا إلى مشهد للدمار والمعاناة التي تفوق الوصف، بالأخص مع سقوط آلاف القتلى ونزوح مئات الآلاف من الفلسطينيين وحظر إدخال مواد الإيواء إلى غزة. وقد ازداد الوضع سوءا مع تفشي الجوع خاصة في شمال غزة، على الرغم من السماح بدخول كميات محدودة للغاية من المساعدات التي لا تكاد تذكر أمام حجم الاحتياجات الهائلة، إلى جانب انهيار المنظومة الصحية بشكل شبه كامل نتيجة للهجمات الإسرائيلية واستمرار حظر إدخال الوقود منذ أشهر. وفي ظل هذا الوضع المأساوي، فقد كان من المحبط للغاية فشل مجلس الأمن بداية هذا الشهر في اعتماد قرار يدعو لوقف فوري ودائم لإطلاق النار في خذلان لمساعي أعضاء مجلس الأمن 14 الذين دعموا مشروع القرار ولآمال الشعب الفلسطيني والمجتمع الدولي. إن سياسة العقاب الجماعي المتمثلة في حرمان مليوني فلسطيني من ضروريات الحياة الأساسية والتهجير القسري لمئات الآلاف واستهداف المنشآت الطبية والصحفيين والعاملين في المجال الإنساني جميعها تمثل انتهاكات صارخة للقانون الدولي الإنساني. السيد الرئيس، ترحب بلادي باعتماد هذه الجمعية القرار المعنون حماية المدنيين والالتزام بالواجبات القانونية والإنسانية، والذي يتضمن مطالبة هامة بوقف فوري وغير مشروط ودائم لإطلاق النار وتسهيل دخول المساعدات الإنسانية بشكل كامل وآمن ودون عوائق. كما نجدد دعمنا لجهود جمهورية مصر العربية ودولة قطر والولايات المتحدة لتحقيق وقف إطلاق النار وإطلاق سراح الرهائن والمحتجزين، ونؤكد تطلعنا لعقد المؤتمر رفيع المستوى لدعم تنفيذ حل الدولتين برئاسة مشتركة من المملكة العربية السعودية وجمهورية فرنسا. وفي الوقت ذاته نعرب عن قلقنا العميق إزاء استمرار التصعيد في المنطقة وتداعياته على الأمن والاستقرار الإقليمي، ونؤكد على أهمية ممارسة أقصى درجات ضبط النفس والحكمة لتجنب توسيع رقعة الصراع، وضرورة حل الخلافات عبر الوسائل الدبلوماسية والالتزام بالقوانين الدولية واحترام سيادة الدول. وفي الختام فإننا ندعو المجتمع الدولي إلى التحرك بشكل جماعي وحاسم لإنقاذ الأرواح وإنهاء هذه المأساة التي طال أمدها. وستظل دولة الإمارات داعمة لكافة المساعي والجهود الدولية الرامية إلى وقف الحرب وتجسيد دولة فلسطينية مستقلة وعاصمتها القدس الشرقية تعيش بأمان وسلام جنبا إلى جنب مع إسرائيل. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
I thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of United Arab Emirates and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, at the outset, allow me to express our gratitude to you for convening this meeting. Algeria aligns itself with the statements delivered on behalf of the E10, the elected member of the Security Council, the Arab Group, and the non-aligned movement. I wish to add the following on my national capacity as representative of Algeria. We meet in the aftermath of yet another painful blow to international legitimacy, when a permanent member chose to cast its veto against a humanitarian draft resolution. A humanitarian draft resolution initiated by my country, Algeria, and carried with integrity, courage, and purpose by the 10 elected members of the Security Council of the United Nations. We, the elected members, whose legitimacy stems from this very assembly, the truest and most universal incarnation of the collective conscience of humanity. A draft supported by the elected member, the E10, and endorsed by 4 permanent members, and yet it was silenced not for lack of support, but because of the will of one. Mr. President, we return today to the source of legitimacy, to the General Assembly, to the constituency that lends authority to the Security Council in the first place. The Council is not sovereign into itself. Its mandate derives from this chamber, from the peoples of the world. Security Council cannot and must not stand in defiance of the will of this Assembly. Algeria will return to the Council, not out of resignation, but out of determination. Determination to make the Council reflect the will of humanity, not the will of the powerful. We will persist. We will persist with the same moral clarity, with the same principles approach, because we must act. We must act to halt a genocide unfolding before our eyes, before your eyes. This is not merely unacceptable. It is unconscionable. Mr. President, to those with short memories, let us be clear. History did not begin on October the 7th. The tragedy of the Palestinian people began long before, with their dispossession, their exile, their arrest, their humiliation, their subjugation, their killing, and now their deliberate starvation. What we are witnessing today is not an isolated event. It is the culmination, the result of decades of violations, of impunity, of occupation, of colonization, and of oppression. It is a transformation of suffering from silent mourning into the language of genocide, from siege to starvation, from massacre to annihilation. So let us speak. Let us speak plainly. The occupation must end. The right of the Palestinian people must be fulfilled, not negotiated, not postponed, fulfilled. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Algeria, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia.
President, thank you for convening this meeting. Malaysia aligns itself with the statement delivered by Uganda on behalf of the non-aligned movement. President, Malaysia is again appalled and deeply disappointed with the inability of the Security Council to mobilize any meaningful action to stop the ongoing massacre of innocent Palestinians and scale up humanitarian aid into Gaza due to the exercise of the veto by a permanent member of the Security Council. We have been warned about the possibility of genocide in Gaza for more than a year already. The International Court of Justice, through its orders of provisional measures issued in January, March, and May 2024, warned us of this possibility in very clear terms. But the Security Council remains deadlocked and failed to act. In the meantime, Israel continues to intensify its aggression, brazenly disregarding rules of international law and international humanitarian law, as well as global outcry and condemnation. In January last year, when the first order of provisional measures was issued, casualties of the war in Gaza stood at approximately 25,000 people. Now it has increased dramatically to more than 55,000 people, about 70% of them being women and children. Since the ceasefire was broken over 2 months ago, approximately 4,300 more lives have been lost. Gaza has been described as a wasteland, a graveyard for children, and most recently, as a place worse than hell on earth. And yet, the Security Council continues to be paralyzed. The United Nations continues to be prevented from doing what the majority of member states demanded to do, that is, to stop the killing of civilians, women, children, and the elderly in Gaza. The inability of the Council to act has been frustrating, preventing the Council from taking decisive action to stop the mass atrocities unfolding in Gaza against the will of the majority of member states is unacceptable. President, Malaysia condemns Israel's breaking of the ceasefire in Gaza on 18 March 2025 and the inhumane and illegal use of starvation as a method of warfare. We also deplore the unlawful denial of humanitarian access and the militarization of humanitarian aid. The aid distribution mechanism under the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has turned out to be a big fiasco, with reports of Palestinians being shot at and killed while trying to get barely sufficient food aid for their families at the distribution centers. It is madness, and it must stop. What must happen is the lifting of the blockade of humanitarian aid imposed by Israel, and the United Nations, as well as credited international humanitarian organizations, being allowed to do their work without impediments. While we continue to push for a ceasefire in Gaza, we must not lose sight of the dangerous escalation of annexation and violence in the West Bank. Settler terrorism is rampant, with the backing of Israeli occupation forces. Settlements are expanding, despite clear determinations by the International Court of Justice of their illegality. In the last 3 weeks alone, 22 new settlements have been approved by the Israeli authorities. Israeli leaders now blatantly speak of occupation and about achieving a greater Israel. The expansionist colonialist agenda of Israeli leaders has become clear, overtly and proudly pronounced. Their boldness is due to the impunity they have long enjoyed and continue to enjoy. Indeed, Israel's impunity has emboldened it to increase its belligerence and spread its war beyond Palestinian territory, as we have witnessed in the last few days. Israel continues to act recklessly, trampling on fundamental principles of international law as it throws the region into greater instability and danger. President, the mass atrocities by Israel against Palestinians over the decades, which has escalated into acts akin to ethnic cleansing and genocide, can only be understood in the context of Israel's expansionist colonialist agenda. This agenda is the root cause of Israel's denial of a sovereign and independent state of Palestine, its illegal occupation of Palestinian lands, and its oppression, dispossession, and forced displacement of Palestinians. It is the main cause of the long and ongoing instability in the region. Peace and security cannot prevail if unlawful activities are allowed to continue. If we, the international community, are committed to upholding the rule of law, our message must be firm and it must be clear. Israel must bring its occupation of Palestinian territory, as well as settlement activities and violence by its settlers, to a rapid end. It must stop denying the Palestinian people their inalienable right to self-determination, to live in an independent and sovereign state. We regret that the high-level international conference on the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine, which opened this morning, has to be suspended. We look forward to the resumption of the conference and are hopeful that it will produce a clear pathway towards the realization of a fully sovereign and independent state of Palestine. President, the international community must take all necessary measures at its disposal to compel Israel to end its occupation of Palestinian land and abide by its obligations under international law. In this regard, we commend actions taken by a number of countries, which include suspending bilateral trade and social relations with Israel. The recent imposition of sanctions on the extremist Israeli ministers Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir is welcomed. These sanctions should be expanded to also include several other Israeli leaders who continue to incite hatred, dehumanize Palestinians, encourage illegal acts, and provoke hostilities and conflicts. We call on states not to be complicit in Israel's illegal war and occupation by halting the provision of arms and financial support to Israel. We continue to hold the view that the Security Council must adopt a Chapter 7 resolution against Israel without delay for its genocidal war against Palestinians. We also reiterate our call for the defense of UNRWA against Israel's unilateral attempts to dismantle the agency. UNRWA is both essential and irreplaceable. We appreciate member states who co-sponsored and voted in favor of Resolution ES 10/27, which we adopted on Thursday, 12 June. The high numbers of co-sponsors and affirmative votes is a testament of the commitment from overwhelming majority of member states to uphold international law and reject any attempt to strip Palestinians of their rights, dignity, and humanity. President, before I conclude, allow me to reiterate Malaysia's position on the veto. The veto and its undemocratic nature runs against the very principles that the United Nations was built upon. It has no place in a modern and democratic multilateral architecture. Malaysia maintains its position that the exercise of the veto by permanent members of the Security Council must be regulated to deter it from being used unjustifiably or abused. Its application must be prohibited in situations involving mass atrocity crimes, such as genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes. However, we maintain that ultimately the veto needs to be abolished altogether. Malaysia will continue to work constructively with other member states through the intergovernmental negotiations on the Security Council reform towards improving the United Nations to make it more efficient, open, transparent, and inclusive. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malaysia, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Norway.
President, last Thursday, this Assembly overwhelmingly adopted a resolution calling for a ceasefire in and a humanitarian access to Gaza. 14 members of the Security Council agree with the General Assembly. Norway therefore strongly regrets that the Security Council, again, failed to pronounce itself on this issue. With the latest regional escalation, we call for restraint by the parties involved and for respect for international law. Now, more than ever, we need to keep focused on the civilians in Gaza and the West Bank. They must not be forgotten. Israel has for more than 3 months